Hello everyone, my name is Caitlin Heil and my presentation is on the historiography of fairy tales. The timeline of my monographs starts in 1985 and goes until 2021, so it is a timeline of 36 years. The first monograph that I have is by Pamela Berger, The Goddess Obscured, Transformation of the Grain Protectress from Goddess to Saint, published in 1985. This tells how religious factions took the image of mythic figures, such as in this case the grain goddess, and turned her into a saint for Christian iterations of the folktale. Recent scholarly intersection between anthropologists, literary folklorists, psychologists, and historians associated with art and religion made it possible for new stories to be able to be dissected, because now the experts of their professions were working together. Berger was one of the first to take advantage of this to analyze the folklore of the goddess in relation to religion by studying tangible artifacts such as art and statues, along with literary sources like poems. The next monograph that we have is Off with Their Heads, Fairy Tales and the Culture of Childhood by Maria Tatar, published in 1992. This was an analyzation of fairy tales in relation to socializing children, as well as a gendered analysis of fairy tales. This was comparing women's and children's roles as dutiful daughters who would take care of everyone's needs. Women who did not were labeled as wicked, and once again this looks how religious values would shape fairy tales, such as Berger mentioned. Tatar also mentioned that fairy tales were not stable entities, and that they would morph based on societal and cultural needs and morals. The next monograph is by Anderson Graham, Fairy Tale in the Ancient World, published in 2000. This was the first modern general study of ancient fairy tales. Most scholars of the classics did not have an interest in studying the tales, therefore it didn't gain much attention, until Graham brought it to light. He puts forth unsuspected candidates, such as mythological characters of classical variants of modern fairy tales. He referred to fairy and folk tales as mythos, or tales or stories, tying mythology and fairy tales together just like Berger did. He also asserts that fairy tales originally were meant for adults rather than the notion that they were meant for kids because of the violence. Graham also mentioned that all fairy tales have basic frameworks, and this was different from Tatar, who said that they were unstable entities. The next monograph is by Ruth Boddingheimer, Fairy Tales, A New History. This implores readers to question the origins of fairy tales that she claims was built on a flimsy foundation of belief rather than evidence. This was a systematic re-examination of fairy tale origins and dissemination. This examines the history of publishing from 16th century Venice and beyond. Some key terms that Boddingheimer highlighted were commercial mechanisms and marketability. Perhaps the dissemination of fairy tales are better understood as not relating to people's emotions, but rather suppliers recognizing and responding to which fairy tales were profitable. This differs from all previous historiographies, especially Graham, who had found loose evidence of fairy tale type stories in ancient times. The next monograph is by Jack Zipes, The Irresistible Fairy Tale, The Cultural and Social History of a Genre. Zipes believed the evolution of storytelling reflected the struggles of humans to adapt to their changing natural and social environments. And then, Zipes went after other authors like Boddingheimer, who Zipes believed dismissed the importance of oral storytelling by reducing the genre that privileges print over orality. However, Zipes did not completely dismiss the idea that print had to do with the spread of fairy tales, saying oral and literary works did work together. Also, as Berger and Tatar did, there was a gendered analysis of women as witches, as well as women who told, collected, and wrote tales largely ignored even by folklorists. The last monograph that we have is A Cultural History of Fairy Tales in Medieval Ages, published in 2021 and edited by Susan Ehrenstein. The question was, how did the Middle Ages come to equal Once Upon a Time? Part of the answer was that the medieval past, the Middle Ages term, was actually invented. It was a construct of human imagination, just like fairy tales. And then a quote, tales have often been used to process the socialization for both children and adults, men and women, articulating class, gender, and ethnic differences. As such, tales cannot be separated from questions of power and ideology. This deals with the socialization of children, as Tatar mentioned, and also mentioning that fairy tales could have been geared towards adults, as Graham mentioned. And then another quote, while all agree that the Middle Ages are central to fairy tales, many scholars assert that there was no actual medieval fairy tale. Some scholars say there was no evidence of tales in antiquity, such as Boddingheimer, where some say that they did exist in antiquity, such as Graham and Zipes. To sum up all these monographs, Ehrenstein wrote, medieval fairy tales, like all fairy tales, adapted themselves to their cultural moment. The timeline of my historiography starts with Berger in 1985, who said there was a new intersection of disciplines created the ability to analyze new sources related to folklore. Next, in 1992, Tatar mentioned that the culture of adolescence and women's roles analyzed in relation to folk and fairy tales. In 2000, Graham wrote the first analysis of fairy tales in the ancient world. Most all fairy tales had a derivative in antiquity. In 2009, Boddingheimer re-examined the fairy tale origins and dissemination. Fairy tales were commercialized and spread through print. Zipes examined evolution and storytelling from antiquity, orality and print, gender stereotypes, and female storytellers. In 2021, Ehrenstein examined the Middle Ages and fairy tales as a construct of human imagination. Tales adapted themselves to their cultural movement and moment, where fantasy meant reality. Here is my biography, and thank you.